Chapter 1. The Garden Fete. The late summer sun had draped the village of St. Mildred's in a warm, forgiving light, the sort that softened even the sharp edges of scandal and memory. The annual church garden fete was in full swing, with trestle tables groaning under the weight of sponge cakes, strawberry tarts, and the inevitable fiercely contested jars of homemade jam. From the cricket pitch drifted the amiable shouts of men in rolled-up sleeves and women with parasols, who pretended to watch the match, while their eyes darted instead toward the raffle prizes lined up beneath the elm. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath a faded awning near the tea tent, a plate of seed cake untouched before her, and her knitting bag resting primly on her lap. She had been asked, ever so sweetly by the vicar's wife, not to exert herself this year. But Miss Marple, as she knew and as others often forgot, never needed to exert herself in order to notice things. Her pale blue eyes wandered, seemingly without focus, from one villager to the next. Here was Mrs. Bunting, her hat slightly askew, laughing too loudly at something Mr. Howard had said. There, young Lucy Trevelyan, pouring tea with a grace entirely at odds with the anxious way she glanced toward the cake stall every few minutes. All perfectly ordinary, all quite unremarkable, until you saw them together. It was in this unhurried rhythm of village chatter that the first small discord struck. A gasp, quick and sharp, came from the far side of the tea tent, followed by a startled cry. Chairs scraped, the hum of conversation faltered. Someone dropped a spoon. It landed with a clatter. Miss Marple rose, unhurried but alert, her knitting needles tucked away as she moved toward the sound. At the center of the gathering crowd stood Mr. Jasper Hargreaves, the churchwarden, his ruddy face gone an alarming shade of pale. In front of him, slumped in one of the folding chairs, was Mrs. Margaret Copley, widely admired for her bridge skills and equally notorious for her ability to hold grudges. Her head lolled to one side, her eyes glassy. One fragile hand still clutched the handle of a delicate china teacup, the other rested limply in her lap. The tea inside was barely touched. "She's fainted," someone exclaimed, though the flatness in Mrs. Copley's expression suggested otherwise. The doctor was summoned, but before he arrived, Miss Marple stepped quietly to the table where the teacup had been set down. There, against the white porcelain, were two perfect fingerprints, one belonging, perhaps, to Mrs. Copley, and the other set at an odd angle on the opposite side, as if from someone handing it to her in haste. Miss Marple's eyes rested on that cup for no more than a heartbeat before she looked away, her expression politely vacant. She listened to the murmurs begin their slow ripple through the gathering, speculation, whispered questions, the brittle edge of fear in voices that only moments earlier had been discussing the weather. By the time Dr. Partridge arrived to declare Mrs. Copley quite dead, the village's pleasant afternoon had shifted into something tight and uncertain. Miss Marple, now seated again with her seed cake, listened to the growing chorus of half-formed theories. "A wasp sting," said one. "A weak heart," offered another. But Miss Marple knew enough of human nature to recognize that in St. Mildred's, even the most convivial of gatherings could conceal motives far darker than anyone cared to admit, and that sometimes the truth sat quietly in plain sight, disguised in something as small as a teacup with two fingerprints. Chapter 2. The village reacts. The death of Mrs. Margaret Copley at the garden fete was, in the immediate sense, a tragedy, but in the hours that followed it became something else entirely. In St. Mildred's, tragedy was not a private matter. It was a shared event, dissected and turned over like a curious object passed from hand to hand. By the time the last of the trestle tables had been cleared and the bunting taken down, the village was already alive with murmurs, each more elaborate than the last. At the High Street grocer's that very evening, Mrs. Dobbins, who claimed to have been the first to notice Mrs. Copley's distress, recounted her version of events to anyone within earshot. "It was sudden, I tell you," she insisted, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial pitch. One moment she was laughing, well, smirking, you know how she could be, and the next her face went quite slack. Dead before the teacup even rattled on the saucer. Mrs. Dobbins was sure, absolutely sure, that it was the heat. She never took to hot weather, she added, as if it were the final definitive word on the matter. Across the road in the post office, Mr. Lenton was of an entirely different opinion. "A wasp," he declared, slapping the counter for emphasis. "Saw one buzzing around her table earlier. Could have been an allergy. Easy as that." He relished the drama of his theory, nodding as though the case were closed. Yet Mrs. Harris, who was queuing behind him, whispered that Mrs. Copley had no known allergies, but did have enemies, though she declined to say who. Miss Marple, meanwhile, heard more than her share, without needing to ask. On her way home from the fete, she had stopped at the vicarage to return a borrowed book, and found the vicar's wife deep in conversation with Mrs. Alder, a formidable woman whose sharp eyes had missed little over the years. "It's such a dreadful thing," Mrs. Alder said, "but it does make you think. She had that quarrel with Mr. Hargreaves over the parish accounts last year. Nasty business, that was." She caught sight of Miss Marple in the doorway and added with a polite smile, "Not that I'm suggesting anything, of course." The next morning, the air in St. Mildred's was crisp and bright, as though determined to carry on regardless of the previous day's events. Yet there was a restlessness beneath the surface. People lingered longer than usual outside the baker's, exchanging hushed words and glances. Even the milkman, who prided himself on his punctuality, was seen loitering outside Mrs. Penbury's garden, clearly drawn into the latest round of speculation. The official word from Dr. Partridge was that the cause of death remained uncertain, pending further examination, but that did nothing to stem the tide of theories. At the heart of the chatter, Mr. Jasper Hargreaves found himself uncomfortably in the spotlight. His was a name that surfaced again and again, not in outright accusation, but in the careful, suggestive way that made it impossible to ignore. He had, after all, been standing nearest to Mrs. Copley when she collapsed. He had been seen speaking to her, and more than one person recalled the odd expression on his face afterward. Mr. Hargreaves responded to these whispers with bluster, assuring all who asked that Mrs. Copley had been perfectly well moments before, and that he had no idea what had happened. Still, the whispers persisted. Miss Marple, for her part, neither defended nor condemned him. She accepted a morning invitation to tea at Mrs. Penbury's cottage, where the conversation, predictably, turned to the subject at hand. "It's a terrible shock," Mrs. Penbury sighed, pouring a fresh cup. "But you know, Margaret wasn't without her faults. She could be unkind in that clever way of hers. Some people never forget a slight." She spoke the last sentence with a pointed glance toward Miss Marple, as though expecting her to nod in agreement. Instead, Miss Marple merely stirred her tea with unhurried precision. "It is curious," she murmured, almost to herself, "how certain moments become fixed in the memory, while others, just as near in time, vanish entirely. One wonders why that should be." Mrs. Penbury, unsure whether this was a comment on the matter at hand or simply one of Miss Marple's gentle meanderings, smiled politely and changed the subject to the chrysanthemums in her garden. Yet the remark lingered in Miss Marple's mind long after she had taken her leave. She walked slowly along the lane back to her cottage, her eyes on the hedgerows, though she noticed more than the occasional late bloom. She thought of the teacup, the prints upon it, and the way Mrs. Copley had held it, an odd grip for a woman so precise in her manners. She thought, too, of the timing, the moment the tea had been poured, the person who had handed it to her, the brief exchange of words no one seemed to recall clearly. By evening, the police had arrived from Much Benham, their presence a novelty in the village. Inspector Mallory, a tall, neat man with a fondness for conclusive statements, was seen questioning Mr. Hargreaves in the church hall. He emerged later with a set jaw and the air of someone who had found the obvious answer. Miss Marple watched from the opposite side of the road, her small frame blending easily into the lamplit shadows. The inspector's certainty, she knew, was both his strength and his weakness. In her experience, the obvious answer was very rarely the correct one. In the parlor of her cottage that night, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and sat quietly for some time. The village, she knew, would not rest until the mystery was solved, though what it thought of as solved might be very different from the truth. And the truth, she suspected, was waiting not in the broad strokes of the day's gossip, but in one or two small, overlooked details. She smiled faintly to herself. It was, after all, the small things that so often betrayed the largest secrets. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The morning after the police interviews, St. Mildred's carried an odd air of enforced normality. Shop shutters rose at their usual hour, the church bell tolled for morning prayers, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from the bakery. Yet beneath the outward routine, there was a tautness to the village, as if every door concealed a listener straining to catch the latest rumor. Miss Marple, taking her habitual stroll into the high street, seemed absorbed in the mild September sunlight, her eyes on the hedgerows where sparrows darted between branches. Those who greeted her with polite smiles could not have guessed how carefully she was noting the rhythm of their steps, the unease in their voices, the way some of them glanced over their shoulders as though expecting to be overheard. The police had wasted no time in their inquiries. Inspector Mallory had established a small base in the vestry, where the polished oak table now held files, notebooks, and a silver tray of untouched sandwiches. He moved with the efficiency of a man who preferred order to ambiguity, and his conclusion, still unofficial but already making its rounds, was that Mr. Jasper Hargreaves, was the most likely suspect. There had been, after all, that quarrel over parish funds, and his proximity to Mrs. Copley at the moment of her collapse was difficult to ignore. Miss Marple, however, had learned long ago that proximity and guilt were not always the same thing. On her way to the grocer's, she paused to speak with young Lucy Trevelyan, who was standing outside the post office, fussing with the clasp of her handbag. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," Lucy said, lowering her voice, though the street was nearly empty. "I can't stop thinking about it. Mrs. Copley, well, she could be sharp-tongued, but I never imagined—" She trailed off, biting her lip. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, an expression of gentle interest on her face. "Yes, my dear. She had her opinions. People often do, particularly when they've lived long enough to believe they're justified in them." Lucy gave a nervous smile and glanced toward the post office door, as if someone inside might be listening. "It's just, I saw her take the tea. I saw who gave it to her." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But I don't think it was Mr. Hargreaves." Before Miss Marple could inquire further, Lucy excused herself and hurried away, leaving the older woman to continue her walk at a measured pace. That afternoon, Miss Marple accepted an invitation from Mrs. Alder, who was eager to discuss the matter under the guise of offering scones. Mrs. Alder's parlor was immaculate, the polished surfaces gleaming in the slanting light. "The inspector was here yesterday," she said as she poured the tea. "Asked me all sorts of questions about the fate, where I was standing, who I spoke to. I told him straight. Margaret Copley had more than her share of quarrels. She had a way of making enemies without quite meaning to. There's no shortage of people who might have wanted to see her out of the way." Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting the faint tremor in Mrs. Alder's hand as she set down the pot. It was not fear exactly, but something akin to discomfort. Leaving Mrs. Alder's, Miss Marple walked past the church hall and noticed the tea tent still partially dismantled. A few folding chairs leaned against the wall, and on one of the trestle tables lay a stack of cups and saucers waiting to be washed. She lingered by the entrance, observing the volunteers as they worked. Mrs. Harris, brisk and efficient, drying the china. Young Michael Penbury, stacking plates with more clatter than care. From a distance, it all seemed perfectly ordinary. but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the tea urn, still sitting on the counter, and the way Mrs. Harris avoided looking at it. Later, as she returned to her own cottage, she reflected on how quickly a village's collective memory could shift. On the day of the fete, everyone had been caught in the suddenness of Mrs. Copley's collapse. Now, details were already becoming pliable, shaped to fit the teller's preferences. She had heard 3 different accounts of who poured the fatal cup, and each placed the action in a slightly different sequence. Somewhere among them, she knew, was the truth, or at least the shape of it. That evening, she found herself at the window, gazing out across the green where the last of the fete's bunting had been taken down. The village looked peaceful, bathed in the golden light of sunset, but Miss Marple knew such appearances were never to be trusted. Beneath the calm surface, motives and resentment stirred like the currents beneath a still pond. And it was in those subtle movements, barely perceptible to most, that the answers to such puzzles were so often found. She took up her knitting, the familiar rhythm of the needles keeping pace with her thoughts, and wondered which of her neighbors would next let something slip. Chapter 4. First Suspects. By the next morning, the inspector's theory had taken firm root in St. Mildred's. Mr. Jasper Hargreaves, whether guilty or not, had become the focal point of every conversation. In the parlor of the Crown and Feather, the publican swore that Hargreaves had been in a right temper with Mrs. Copley only a fortnight before. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Dobbins declared she'd never liked his manner, which was apparently as good as proof to her mind. The gossip moved like ivy, clinging to whatever surface it touched and growing more tangled by the hour. Inspector Mallory seemed satisfied with the village's readiness to accept his view. The man had motive, opportunity, and proximity, he told the constable from Much Benham, within earshot of half the high street. It was as though he believed the case already solved, save for the formalities. He visited Hargreaves at his home that afternoon, accompanied by Sergeant Drury, and left with a tight expression and a notebook half filled. By the time evening fell, the general opinion was that an arrest could be expected within the week. Miss Marple, however, had not altered her pace of inquiry. She paid a short call to Mrs. Penbury, ostensibly to return a gardening book, and found her in the kitchen polishing silver. "They'll have him, you'll see," Mrs. Penbury said at once, hardly waiting for a greeting. "It's all very straightforward. He hated her, he handed her the tea, and now she's gone. Simple as that." Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes on the gleam of the polished teapot. "Things that seem simple at first," she murmured, "often prove to have hidden layers, don't you find?" Mrs. Penbury gave a vague shrug. The words neither agreed with nor disputed. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow route past the church hall. The tea tent had been entirely taken down now, leaving only flattened grass and a few scraps of paper drifting in the breeze. The scene had been cleared, yet she could picture it still, the arrangement of the tables, the way Mrs. Copley's chair had been slightly apart from the others, the peculiar position of that teacup in her hand. Details that the inspector might consider incidental, but which to Miss Marple held the quiet weight of significance. She was still deep in thought when she heard footsteps behind her. Lucy Trevelyan had caught up, looking pale and a little out of breath. "Miss Marple," she said quickly, "I've been thinking about what I told you, about seeing someone give Mrs. Copley the tea." She glanced around, lowering her voice. "It was Mrs. Harris. I didn't say before because she's always been so kind to me, but I saw her pass the cup, I'm certain of it." Miss Marple laid a light hand on the girl's arm. "My dear, kindness and truth are not always the same thing. But it's important to remember that handing a cup is not the same as causing harm. We mustn't mistake one for the other." Lucy looked uncertain, as though she had expected her confession to be met with greater alarm. That evening, the inspector called on Miss Marple. He had the air of a man seeking not advice, but confirmation. You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple. Surely you've seen it yourself. Hargreaves fits the bill. Quarrel, proximity, temper. Miss Marple listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Yes, Inspector, those are certainly points to consider. And yet, I always think of something my old schoolmistress used to say, that people rarely quarrel with those they truly mean to harm. The reasons, when they come to it, are often far more subtle. Mallory gave her a polite, slightly puzzled nod, perhaps unused to having his conclusions met with gentle contradiction. After he left, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the lamplight spill across the green. Somewhere in the quiet of the village, she felt certain someone was sleeping less soundly than usual, not because they feared the inspector's suspicion, but because they knew it was aimed in the wrong direction. And in the wrong direction, she thought, was often precisely where the real culprit liked it to stay. Chapter 5. First Suspects. By the next morning, the inspector's theory had taken firm root in St. Mildred's. Mr. Jasper Hargreaves, whether guilty or not, had become the focal point of every conversation. In the parlor of the Crown and Feather, the publican swore that Hargreaves had been in a right temper with Mrs. Copley only a fortnight before. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Dobbins declared she'd never liked his manner, which was apparently as good as proof to her mind. The gossip moved like ivy, clinging to whatever surface it touched and growing more tangled by the hour. Inspector Mallory seemed satisfied with the village's readiness to accept his view. The man had motive, opportunity, and proximity, he told the constable from Much Benham, within earshot of half the high street. It was as though he believed the case already solved, save for the formalities. He visited Hargreaves at his home that afternoon, accompanied by Sergeant Drury, and left with a tight expression and a notebook half-filled. By the time evening fell, the general opinion was that an arrest could be expected within the week. Miss Marple, however, had not altered her pace of inquiry. She paid a short call to Mrs. Penbury, ostensibly to return a gardening book, and found her in the kitchen polishing silver. "They'll have him, you'll see," Mrs. Penbury said at once, hardly waiting for a greeting. "It's all very straightforward. He hated her. He handed her the tea, and now she's gone. Simple as that." Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes on the gleam of the polished teapot. "Things that seem simple at first," she murmured, "often prove to have hidden layers, don't you find?" Mrs. Penbury gave a vague shrug, the words neither agreed with nor disputed. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow route past the church hall. The tea tent had been entirely taken down now, leaving only flattened grass and a few scraps of paper drifting in the breeze. The scene had been cleared. Yet she could picture it still, the arrangement of the tables, the way Mrs. Copley's chair had been slightly apart from the others, the peculiar position of that teacup in her hand. Details that the inspector might consider incidental, but which, to Miss Marple, held the quiet weight of significance. She was still deep in thought when she heard footsteps behind her. Lucy Trevelyan had caught up, looking pale and a little out of breath. "Miss Marple," she said quickly, "I've been thinking about what I told you, about seeing someone give Mrs. Copley the tea." She glanced around, lowering her voice. "It was Mrs. Harris? I didn't say before because she's always been so kind to me. But I saw her pass the cup. I'm certain of it." Miss Marple laid a light hand on the girl's arm. "My dear, kindness and truth are not always the same thing. But it's important to remember that handing a cup is not the same as causing harm. We mustn't mistake one for the other." Lucy looked uncertain, as though she had expected her confession to be met with greater alarm. That evening, the inspector called on Miss Marple. He had the air of a man seeking not advice but confirmation. "You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple. Surely you've seen it yourself. Hargreaves fits the bill. Quarrel, proximity, temper." Miss Marple listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Yes, Inspector, those are certainly points to consider. And yet, I always think of something my old schoolmistress used to say, that people rarely quarrel with those they truly mean to harm. The reasons, when they come to it, are often far more subtle. Mallory gave her a polite, slightly puzzled nod, perhaps unused to having his conclusions met with gentle contradiction. After he left, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the lamplight spill across the green. Somewhere in the quiet of the village, she felt certain someone was sleeping less soundly than usual, not because they feared the inspector's suspicion, but because they knew it was aimed in the wrong direction. And in the wrong direction, she thought, was often precisely where the real culprit liked it to stay. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. 2 days after Inspector Mallory's visit, the village had settled into a strained rhythm. Life went on. Children walked to school. The milkman made his rounds. But there was a quietness to it, as though the air itself were listening. The suspicion that hung over Mr. Hargreaves had not lessened. In fact, it had deepened, solidified by repetition, until it felt to many like certainty. Yet Miss Marple, knitting on her front porch in the late morning sun, seemed content to let the current of opinion flow around her. She had learned long ago that the truest things often came from those who thought they were saying nothing of importance. It was while she was in the grocer's that the clue first took shape in her mind. She had gone in for flour and found Mrs. Harris behind the counter, helping to mind the shop in Mr. Lenton's absence. The woman's sleeves were rolled up, her hands moving with brisk efficiency as she weighed out sugar for a customer. "Shame about the fate ending the way it did," Mrs. Harris remarked without looking up. "And to think it all happened so quickly. Why, 1 minute I was at the cake stall, and the next, poor Margaret was gone." Her words were perfectly ordinary, yet Miss Marple, who remembered Lucy Trevelyan's account of seeing Mrs. Harris hand the tea to Mrs. Copley, noted the careful placement of that cake stall in the story, as though the woman were putting herself at a safe distance from the tea tent. Later that day, Miss Marple called on the vicar's wife to return a hymn book and found her arranging flowers for the altar. As they chatted, Miss Marple inquired whether the fete committee had kept a record of the raffle prizes and their donors. The vicar's wife, mildly surprised by the question, fetched a small ledger from the side table. Flipping through it, Miss Marple's eyes settled on an entry for a set of 6 china teacups, donated by Mrs. Copley herself. The thought drifted through her mind like a leaf on water. If Mrs. Copley had brought those cups, she might have been more inclined to notice if one had been out of place. And yet, she had taken the one with the 2 fingerprints. Why? That evening, Miss Marple walked past the church hall just as the door stood ajar for a parish meeting. Through the gap, she caught sight of the table where the tea things had been stacked on the day of the fete. She stepped inside, explaining to the startled verger that she had come to collect a misplaced knitting needle. While she made a show of looking under the tables, her gaze settled on a tray at the back, holding the last of the teacups. They were plain white china, all but one, which had a faint hairline crack along the handle. It was that cracked cup that caught her attention. The verger, seeing her interest, remarked, "That one's been here for years. Bit of a survivor, really. I keep meaning to throw it out." Miss Marple smiled politely, but in her mind, the thought took hold. A cracked cup would often be avoided by those pouring tea, yet it had been handed to Mrs. Copley. Was that by chance, or design? And if design, then the person who handed it to her must have chosen it deliberately, knowing it would pass unnoticed amid the bustle of the fete. The following morning, she encountered Mr. Hargreaves outside the post office. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed. "They're saying the inspector's nearly ready to charge me," he said without preamble. "I didn't poison her, Miss Marple. I didn't give her the tea." She studied him for a moment, then replied in her mildest voice, "People often see what they expect to see, Mr. Hargreaves, but the truth has a way of remaining just where it is, waiting for someone to notice it." His brow furrowed, but before he could speak further, the postmistress appeared. and the moment was gone. That night, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, the teacup in her thoughts as much as if it were sitting on the table before her. She considered the cracked handle, the 2 fingerprints, the subtle shift in Mrs. Harris's account. Small things, easily dismissed by others, yet to her they felt like the faint but certain outline of something larger. She knew better than to rush. People revealed themselves in time and often with less prompting than they realized. The trick was to be patient and let the pieces fall into place. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. By the following afternoon, a faint shift in the village air was noticeable. It wasn't that the gossip had lessened. If anything, it had only grown, but there was a new sharpness to it, a sense of sides quietly being taken. Miss Marple observed it in the smallest ways. In the way Mrs. Dobbins crossed the road to avoid speaking to Mr. Hargreaves, in the clipped tone with which Mrs. Alder addressed Mrs. Harris and the greengrocer's. Even at the post office, the postmistress seemed suddenly reluctant to meet certain customers' eyes. Such silences, Miss Marple knew, could speak louder than open accusation. That evening, the parish council met in the church hall, ostensibly to discuss the harvest festival arrangements. But Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in the back, noticed the talk of hymn choices and bunting gave way with little resistance to veiled references to the fete. "We must ensure," Mrs. Alder said with a certain relish, "that such an incident does not occur again." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Mrs. Harris, who sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap. Mr. Hargreaves, looking grim, said nothing throughout, though his jaw tightened each time his name was mentioned in a passing. After the meeting, Miss Marple lingered by the doorway, listening to the scatter of private conversations. 2 voices, low but tense, caught her attention. Lucy Trevelyan and Mrs. Harris, standing just beyond the hall's lamplight. "I told you not to say anything," Mrs. Harris murmured, her tone edged with warning. "But I—" Lucy began, before breaking off abruptly as she noticed Miss Marple approaching. Mrs. Harris managed a brittle smile. "Good evening, Miss Marple. Chilly tonight, isn't it?" The older woman agreed softly, her eyes holding Lucy's for a fraction longer than necessary. The next morning brought a small but telling scene outside the bakery. Miss Marple, waiting her turn in the queue, watched as Mrs. Alder confronted Mr. Hargreaves in a voice just loud enough for others to hear. "If you had any decency, Jasper, you'd come clean and save the rest of us the trouble." He gave her a hard stare, his voice tight but controlled. "And if you had any sense, you'd stop talking about things you don't understand." The exchange was brief, yet in its wake, conversation in the bakery turned even more guarded, as though everyone feared stepping into the open rift. Miss Marple's own visits that day took her to the vicarage, where she found the vicar's wife looking unusually drawn. Over tea, she confided that Mrs. Copley had been more than simply sharp-tongued. There had been letters, pointed, unpleasant letters, sent anonymously but widely assumed to be her doing. It was never proved, of course, the vicar's wife said. But she had a way of discovering things about people, things they'd rather stayed quiet. She hesitated before adding, "And I suspect she'd found something out about someone recently." She seemed satisfied with herself. Miss Marple nodded slowly, turning the thought over in her mind. That evening, walking home along the quiet lane, she passed the glow of light from Mrs. Harris's kitchen. Through the half-open curtain, she glimpsed the woman standing at the sink, her shoulders tense, staring into nothing. There was a peculiar stillness to her, the sort that comes not from peace but from a mind occupied with unwelcome thoughts. Miss Marple walked on without pausing, but the image stayed with her. Secrets, she knew, rarely sat quietly for long. They shifted, pressed, and sometimes broke their way to the surface. In her parlour later, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the rhythmic click of the needles accompanying her reflections. The undercurrents in St. Mildred's were moving faster now, pulling certain people closer to the surface, while others receded into wary silence. She did not yet know the whole of it, but she could feel the pattern beginning to form, thin, almost invisible threads drawing together toward a knot. And knots, as she well knew, were meant to be untangled. Chapter 7. Another twist. The rain came down hard the next morning, slicking the cobblestones and casting the village in a grey, muffled light. From her front window, Miss Marple watched the postman hurry along the lane, his shoulders hunched, the letters in his satchel growing damp despite the leather flap. It was the sort of day when people kept to themselves, preferring the warmth of a kitchen fire to the chill of the street. Yet by mid-morning, that hush was broken by the arrival of Sergeant Drury at the Crown and Feather, his uniform soaked through, his expression grim. Within half an hour, word had begun to spread. Another incident had taken place. By the time Miss Marple reached the scene, the lane behind the grocer's was cordoned off with nothing more than a length of rope and a sternly worded warning from Inspector Mallory. On the ground, half hidden by the shelter of an overturned crate, lay Mr. Lenton, the grocer himself, pale and dazed but alive. The inspector stood over him, his jaw tight. "Said he felt faint," Mallory muttered to Sergeant Drury. "Same as Copley. Tea again, but he's still breathing." The words were enough to ripple through the small crowd that had gathered, their umbrellas leaning like crooked sentinels in the rain. Miss Marple did not push forward. Instead, she observed from a little way off, her gaze resting on Mrs. Harris, who stood apart from the others, her face drawn and oddly blank. Nearby, Mrs. Alder whispered urgently to Lucy Trevelyan, who kept glancing toward the grocer with a troubled expression. The rain seemed to magnify the unease, turning the street's chatter into a low, continuous hum. Later, in the vicarage kitchen where she had been invited to dry her coat, Miss Marple listened as the vicar's wife recounted what she had heard. Mr. Lenton had been preparing a pot of tea for himself and a delivery man when he suddenly complained of dizziness. The delivery man, sent to fetch help, found him moments later on the ground, the teacup smashed beside him. "It's uncanny," the vicar's wife said, her voice low. "Same sort of thing, just without the finality." She hesitated, then added, "And he'd only just mended his quarrel with Mrs. Copley last month. I wonder if that matters." That evening, Miss Marple took her place at her parlor window, watching the street lamps blur in the wet. A second incident, so soon after the first, was not a coincidence. Someone, she thought, was testing something, or someone. If the first act had been decisive, the second seemed almost like a warning, a reminder that the danger was not yet past, and if that was the case, then the choice of victim was telling. She rose and crossed to her writing desk, where she kept a small notebook of village matters, not in any official capacity, but as a habit born of long years observing the ebb and flow of human behavior. She flipped to a page from 2 weeks before, when Mrs. Copley had attended the fete planning meeting. Mr. Lenton's name appeared there, alongside Mrs. Harris's, in connection with the tea arrangements. The pattern, faint but insistent, began to take shape again in her mind. The next day, as the rain lightened, she encountered Lucy Trevelyan outside the post office. The girl's eyes were shadowed, her voice hesitant. "Miss Marple, do you think the two things, Mrs. Copley and Mr. Lenton, are connected?" Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "I think, my dear, that when something happens twice in the same place and in much the same way, it's usually unwise to assume it's chance." Lucy bit her lip and glanced around. "Then, do you think Mrs. Harris could be in danger?" The older woman didn't answer directly, but her expression was thoughtful as they parted. That night, Miss Marple sat with her knitting and let the rhythm of the needles guide her thoughts. 2 incidents, 2 cups of tea, and a narrowing circle of people who could have been responsible. But why choose Mr. Lenton after Mrs. Copley? Was it to divert suspicion, or to settle a second, unrelated grievance. The rain had stopped outside, leaving the street glistening under the lamplight, but in her mind, the threads of the case were still tangled. Somewhere among them lay the knot she needed to pull, the one that would unravel the whole. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The morning after Mr. Lenton's collapse dawned clear. The heavy rain swept away, leaving the hedgerows glittering with dew. The brightness of the day seemed at odds with the subdued atmosphere in St. Mildred's. People went about their business, but there was a carefulness to their movements, as though each feared stepping into something unseen. Miss Marple, taking her walk toward the green, noted the way conversations broke off when she drew near. It wasn't out of rudeness. Indeed, she was greeted warmly enough, but rather the instinctive caution of people aware that something in their midst had yet to be resolved. Inspector Mallory was at the church hall again, making notes in his usual brisk hand. He looked up as Miss Marple passed, his expression a blend of weariness and stubborn conviction. "If it's connected," he said without preamble, "it means we've got someone playing a longer game than I like. But it doesn't change my mind about Hargreaves." Miss Marple gave him a mild, untroubled smile. "Ah, but games, Inspector, don't always end the way one expects. Sometimes the winning move is made much earlier, and in a place no one thinks to look." He frowned faintly, perhaps unsure whether she was agreeing or contradicting him. Miss Marple had decided, quietly and without announcement, that the time had come to test a theory. Not a confrontation, she rarely found those useful, but a gentle tug at a thread to see what unraveled. She chose her moment late in the afternoon, calling at Mrs. Harris's cottage under the pretext of returning a borrowed jar of marmalade. The kitchen smelled faintly of lavender polish, and the table was neatly set for tea. "How kind of you to stop by," Mrs. Harris said, her voice polite but a shade too brisk. Miss Marple allowed the conversation to wander amiably. Garden pests, the vicar's sermon, the unpredictable weather, before letting it alight on the subject of the fete. "Such a pity about poor Margaret," she said, stirring her tea. "And now, Mr. Lenton, well, it's a comfort, at least, that you've such a steady hand with the urn. I've never seen you spill a drop, even when it's crowded." Mrs. Harris smiled faintly, but her eyes flickered toward the teapot between them. "One has to be careful," she replied. "Accidents can happen so easily." It was a small thing, barely more than an instinct, but Miss Marple thought she caught the tiniest pause before the word accidents. She let the silence rest for a beat, then changed the subject entirely, as though the remark had been of no consequence. Before leaving, she admired the row of teacups on the dresser, matching white china save for one with a hairline crack along the handle. "That one's been in the family for years," Mrs. Harris said quickly, lifting it and setting it aside. "I never use it for guests." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes resting on the cup for a heartbeat longer than courtesy required. The next day, Miss Marple set her plan in motion. She asked the vicar's wife to arrange a small gathering in the church hall, ostensibly to discuss the harvest festival flowers. It was nothing formal, just tea and scones for a handful of parish volunteers. Miss Marple made certain that Mrs. Harris would be present, along with Lucy Trevelyan, Mrs. Alder, and Mr. Hargreaves. The table was laid much as it had been at the fete, complete with the same set of china cups. She herself poured the first round of tea, careful to place the cracked-handled cup at the far end of the table, within Mrs. Harris's reach. The conversation was lively enough at first, though it skirted anything too pointed. Then, as the pot emptied, Miss Marple rose with a smile. "Oh, would you mind topping that up, Mrs. Harris? You do it so much better than I." She stepped back, knitting in hand, and watched. Mrs. Harris reached for the cracked-handled cup, hesitated, and then, after the briefest glance around the table, set it before Mr. Hargreaves. The motion was smooth, practiced, almost invisible. But Miss Marple saw it, and so did Lucy Trevelyan, whose eyes widened slightly. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply took her seat again, the faintest curve of a smile touching her lips as the conversation resumed. The test had been simple. Not to provoke a confession, but to watch the choice being made. And in that choice, she believed, lay the truth. Now, she thought, it was only a matter of timing, of deciding when to let the rest of the village see what she had seen. That evening, back at her cottage, she sat in the soft lamplight, knitting folded in her lap. The pattern was clear now, each stitch of it formed from small, careful observations. But she knew the danger was not yet past. Whoever had set this game in motion had done so with confidence, and confidence could make people bold. The final move, she suspected, was still ahead. The morning after the rain broke cleanly over the hills, St. Mildred's looked rinsed and harmless, as if a good scrubbing could wash away darker thoughts. People stepped out again with that exaggerated cheerfulness villagers adopt after a scare, stopping to remark upon the freshness of the air and the gloss upon the hedges. Miss Marple, strolling past the green with her small handbag and a fold of knitting peeping from its mouth, noticed how conversation dipped when she neared and bobbed up again once she had passed. It was not unkindness, it was caution, the sort that comes when people feel the ground may shift underfoot. She paused by the notice board where Inspector Mallory had tacked his recent bulletins and read them with polite interest, as if news were a dainty to be nibbled rather than a matter to be weighed. Beneath that air of untroubled attention, her mind turned quietly over 2 teacups, a cracked handle, and the odd grace with which guilt sometimes moves when it thinks it has blended into the furniture. She met the inspector near the vestry door, his notebook tucked beneath one arm and the set of his jaw telling of conclusions reached and re-reached until they felt like facts. Mallory gave her a courteous nod, faintly puzzled that she never seemed to ask for news. "We're tightening the circle," he said, glancing toward the lane where Mr. Hargreaves had just passed, hat brim low. "Men who quarrel don't always stop at words." Miss Marple agreed in principle and not in detail, which was her way. "Oh, certainly," she said mildly. But persons who mean mischief very rarely announce themselves by shouting. It is surprising how often they hide in the "yes, of course, let me help" of things. Mallory frowned a little, as if the phrase were a knot he could not pick at present, and excused himself to confer with Sergeant Drury about the urn, the tent, the list of volunteers whose names had already been handled so many times they were becoming polished. Miss Marple had no intention of handling names. She preferred hands and how they moved when they thought no one watched. That afternoon she carried a jar of marmalade, decent, if not remarkable, to a cottage where the curtains were always half drawn and the brass kept bright. A small exchange, she explained on the step, for the kindness of last week's buns. In the kitchen the table was laid with the care of habit, sugar in a lidded bowl, spoons aligned like choir boys, cups in a neat row on the dresser. Miss Marple admired these in the voice of a woman who has broken more saucers than she cares to confess. They spoke, as people do, of garden pests, of the vicar's text on Sunday, of how rain will lay the dust and lift the weeds in the same breath. When tea was poured, Miss Marple's eyes rested only an instant upon a cup with a faint fracture along its handle, a thread of lightning caught in china, before they drifted to the window and the square of sky beyond. It was almost nothing, that glance, but almost nothing is precisely where truth likes to sit. She let the conversation turn, as conversations will, to the fete and to that sickening moment when a chair scraped and a life ended in a sigh that sounded like a denial. "So dreadful," she murmured, stirring her tea with no sugar at all, "and all in a muddle of bustle. I'm hopeless with urns myself. I always slosh or scald or both." The response came quickly and then was checked, like a hand that has reached too far for a biscuit. "One learns to be careful," said her hostess, then amended, "Anyone would, with practice." Miss Marple nodded, apparently satisfied to be tutored in the virtues of steadiness. She complimented the polish on the dresser, asked after a brother in Bristol whose name had been mentioned only once at a whist table, and then never again, and rose at last with the soft fuss of an old lady rearranging her shawl. A friendly visit, a harmless talk, a jar of marmalade left behind, and, in exchange, a rhythm of speech tucked gently into memory. The next morning she took a different tack. At the vicar's wife's request, engineered with a kindness both genuine and useful, she agreed to keep an eye on a little planning tea for harvest flowers. There would be only a handful of people, and they would want scones, and it would be well if someone unhurried poured first, for fear of upsetting delicate arrangements. Miss Marple, arriving early with a plate of seed cake, set about laying the table as if it were a small game of patience. Cups to the right, saucers to the left, plain white all save for one cup whose handle bore the palest fracture. She placed that cup without ceremony at the end of the table where a habitual helper would naturally stand. The room smelt of wood polish and faint lavender, and the heavy urn, familiar, serviceable, breathed its little cloud of steam. She greeted Lucy Trevelyan, who carried napkins carefully, greeted Mr. Hargreaves, who looked as if he wished to be elsewhere and dignified about it, and greeted Mrs. Alder, who examined the scones as if they might be lying. When the last chair scraped back, Miss Marple smiled and made an unremarkable request that is never refused by those who like to be useful. "Would you, dear, top us up? No one steadier than you." She did not watch with her face. Faces betray a watcher's interest, and interest teaches caution to the watched. Instead, she fussed with a plate and a crumb, and took in with a quiet part of the eye what a sharper gaze would miss. Hands reached, a pot tipped, cups were chosen and set out as if at random, which is to say by habit. The cracked-handled cup was lifted, hesitated over, and placed with smooth certainty before the person most convenient to have blamed, should blame be needed. It was done well, with the grace of practice. Lucy's breath caught so softly one would have missed it, and Mr. Hargreaves, oblivious, thanked his benefactor as men do when they are being served and not seen. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her expression unaltered, and asked, to no one in particular, whether chrysanthemums minded an east window. The answer came readily, because people prefer flowers to cups when given the choice. That evening she made no lists. She did not put down names in a line and draw arrows between them like a child with a puzzle. She sat by her window and knitted 2 inches of a modest grey muffler, then undid 1 inch and did it again, for there is comfort in ordering a thing that can be ordered. In her thoughts, she laid the afternoon's small movement beside the grocer's lane, and that beside the fete, and that beside the tidy kitchen with its row of cups and the brisk assurance of accidents. Truth, when she held it lightly, had the feel of a net that draws tight, not by force, but because the fish have swum into it of their own will. She wondered, not for the first time, at the courage of quiet malice, the way it borrows the manner of service and turns it, almost invisibly, toward harm. And she wondered also at the danger of pride, that stern housekeeper of the soul which will not allow a speck to show on the front steps, even if it must sweep trouble under the rug to keep them clean. There remained, of course, the inspector. It is one thing to see. It is another to make seeing general. Miss Marple had no appetite for speeches. She preferred the moment when a man notices that his own conclusion has become uncomfortable and must be shifted, like a chair that creaks. The next day, she paid a short call at the vestry with a tin of biscuits, a prop as good as any, and told a small story about a girl in her youth who always chose the chipped saucer because she fancied it unlucky for others. "Habits are very odd, Inspector," she finished pleasantly. "They put a stitch where no one thinks to look." He listened, wearing the expression of a gentleman who suspects he is being shown a picture in which a key detail hides, and is damned if he will ask where. She did not say more. One ought not hurry a seed. It must break in its own time if it is to grow. By afternoon, arrangements were in motion that did not, strictly speaking, require her. There would be, Mallory announced, a brief meeting to steady nerves and correct misunderstandings, which is what policemen say when they intend to place chairs so that people must sit with their choices. Miss Marple, satisfied that her part was played, took her tea at the window and watched a pair of sparrows quarrel in the privet. She felt no triumph. Such feelings do not sit well with old bones. Instead, there was the sober contentment of a housekeeper who has found the draught that chills a room and knows how to set a wedge beneath the offending door. Tomorrow would do for explanations. Tonight, the village could have its quiet, and in that quiet, she trusted, one pair of hands would tremble. Just enough to betray, to someone newly attentive, the difference between steadiness and the imitation of it. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The following afternoon, St. Mildred's awoke to the news that Inspector Mallory had called for a meeting in the church hall. Officially, it was to share updates and reassure the public. But the tone of the notice posted outside the post office suggested something more final. By mid-morning, the hall was filled with a subdued hum of anticipation. People clustered in small knots, hats and coats dripping from the light drizzle outside, their eyes darting toward the raised platform at the front. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in the second row, kept her hands neatly folded, her face an unreadable mask of politeness. Mallory began with a summary of events. Mrs. Copley's sudden death, the similarities in Mr. Lenton's collapse, and the narrowing of the suspect list. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness beneath it, as if he intended to close the matter before the day was out. It is my belief, he concluded, that these incidents are the work of one individual, someone present at both events, with opportunity to prepare the tea in question. There was a rustle in the crowd, some leaning forward, others whispering. Miss Marple remained still, her gaze fixed not on the inspector but on Mrs. Harris, seated 3 chairs to her left. When Mallory called for questions, Miss Marple rose. The room, accustomed to her quiet presence rather than her public voice, hushed almost instantly. "If I may," she said mildly, "I should like to make an observation. It seems to me that in all the talk of who poured which cup, we have neglected to consider why the same type of cup was used both times, and by whom it was chosen." A murmur ran through the room. Mrs. Harris shifted slightly in her seat, her hands clasping tighter in her lap. Miss Marple spoke without raising her voice, but every ear strained to catch her words. She described the cracked-handled cup, how it had been present at the fete and again during the tea at the church hall, how it had been offered first to Mrs. Copley and later, without hesitation, to Mr. Hargreaves. "It is not an attractive cup," she went on, "and people naturally avoid it unless there is reason to choose it, a reason known only to the one who placed it before them." She let the pause linger, the weight of it settling into the quiet. From the corner of her eye, she saw Lucy Trevelyan watching Mrs. Harris with a mix of fear and dawning comprehension. "There is also," Miss Marple continued, "the matter of fingerprints. 2 on Mrs. Copley's cup. One her own, the other belonging to the person who handed it to her. That person was not Mr. Hargreaves, despite repeated suggestion to the contrary. It was Mrs. Harris, as seen by a witness too hesitant at first to speak." The inspector shifted, his earlier certainty giving way to something more guarded. "You're making a serious implication, Miss Marple," he said. She inclined her head slightly. "I am merely noting the pattern, and patterns, in my experience, tend to reveal the hand that made them. Mrs. Harris had charge of the urn on both occasions, and both times the cup with the crack was the one used. A cracked handle, you see, can conceal a small residue, something quite unpleasant, without it being obvious to the drinker." The room was silent now, save for the faint ticking of the hall clock. Mrs. Harris's lips parted as if to reply, but no words came. Her eyes moved quickly over the faces around her, as though seeking an ally. When she spoke at last, it was in a voice stripped of its usual warmth. "She was going to ruin me," she said, and the confession hung in the air like smoke. "Margaret Copley. She knew about my brother's trouble in Bristol. She said she'd tell. And Lenton, he suspected, after what happened to her. He wouldn't stop asking questions." Mallory moved forward, his expression hardening, but Miss Marple simply sat down, folding her hands in her lap once more. She had known, from the moment Mrs. Harris touched that cracked-handled cup without thinking, that the truth would emerge. It always did, in the end, when the right pressure was applied. Not the force of accusation, but the weight of observation. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, and the cobblestones gleamed in the pale light. As the villagers filed out, their voices low, Miss Marple lingered for a moment, her eyes on the empty cups stacked neatly on the table. Human nature, she thought, was much the same, outwardly orderly, inwardly holding its flaws in quiet concealment, until, inevitably, the crack showed. By mid-morning, the church hall was full of damp coats, lowered voices, and that prickle of expectancy villagers get when they believe answers are about to be handed out like hymn sheets. Inspector Mallory stood at the front with his notes in a precise stack, the vicar hovering near the urn as if proximity to tea might lend comfort. Miss Marple chose a seat in the second row, neither hidden nor prominent, her hat neatly pinned, her hands folded with the serenity of a woman who has all the time in the world. Around her, Mrs. Alder whispered to a neighbour. Mr. Hargreaves sat with his chin lifted as if braced for a blow, and Lucy Trevelyan kept to the aisle, eyes unsettled, as though what she had seen could not quite bear the light. Mallory's summary was tidy, too tidy, Miss Marple thought, but competent nonetheless. He spoke of Mrs. Copley's collapse at the fete, of Mr. Lenton found pale and wavering behind the grocer's, of opportunity and proximity and tempers known to flare. When he invited questions, the hall stirred as if a breeze had crept through it. Miss Marple rose without haste. "If I may, Inspector," she said, her voice gentle yet clear, "I wonder whether we have paid sufficient attention to the vessel rather than the hand. Cups, you see, have habits just as people do." A few chuckles met that, and then quiet, a listening quiet. She described, as one might outline a sewing pattern, the single cup with the hairline crack along its handle. Present at the fete, present again at the flower-planning tea, and curiously avoided by most except on two very particular occasions. "It is not an attractive cup," she went on, eyes resting on a point just above the inspector's shoulder, "and people naturally pass it by unless there is reason to choose it. A crack, however fine, will keep the faintest smear at its seam, invisible to a casual rinse." A rustle moved through the room, and some looked toward the table where the cups were stacked now in blameless rows. Miss Marple did not turn her head. "On both days," she said, "that same cup went to the person most convenient to blame should there be trouble. First to Mrs. Copley, known for quarrels, then toward Mr. Hargreaves, already spoken of unkindly. And on both days, the pourer's hand was the same." Lucy's breath caught. Inspector Mallory's pencil paused. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, as if making a small courtesy to common sense. "A witness, timid at first, has said she saw the cup pass from Mrs. Harris's hand to Mrs. Copley. At the second tea, when I asked for help, I watched, as did the witness, while the cracked cup drifted, almost by instinct, to Mr. Hargreaves' place. It was done with the unself-conscious grace of habit. I'm afraid, Inspector, that we must attend not to loud quarrels, but to quiet competencies." She let that hang, then added, almost apologetically, "2 fingerprints were on the fate cup. One must be the drinker's. The other, I think, belongs to the person who pressed the handle just so." All eyes turned, as eyes will, to the woman who had poured for so many fates and funerals that gratitude had become a sort of shawl about her shoulders. Mrs. Harris's hands were folded too neatly in her lap. For a moment, they did not belong to her. She tried to smile and found it would not fasten. "That cup is old," she said, and the room heard the strain beneath the sentence. "Anyone might have—" Her gaze skittered to the side door, then back. The defense she might have made, the careful little wall of ordinary explanations, collapsed under its own quiet weight. When she spoke again, it was nearly a whisper. "She was going to tell about my brother in Bristol. She said it would be better cleaned with sunlight, the way she talked. There is nothing sunlight cannot sour when people are ready to believe the worst." Inspector Mallory stepped forward, his face set but not unkind. Miss Marple remained standing, not triumphant, her voice scarcely more than a thread. "Fear is an excellent housekeeper, Mrs. Harris. It tidies and hides and convinces one the rug will never be lifted. But rugs are made for lifting." Mrs. Harris's composure frayed. "Lenton guessed something," she muttered. "He kept asking about washing the urn and whether a taste can linger. I meant only to warn him off, only to frighten him." She faltered, the truth finishing itself in the silence. A chair behind scraped, someone gasped, and the hall's great clock ticked as if keeping count of what could not be untold. When Mallory thanked Miss Marple, he did it with a short nod that had nothing perfunctory in it. The vicar, looking a little older, murmured a prayer that did not quite reach his lips. As the hall emptied, people slipped past one another softly, the way they do at funerals. A damp brush of sleeves, averted eyes, small courtesies offering what comfort they could. Miss Marple lingered only long enough to straighten a stack of saucers, her fingertips light upon the harmless, ordinary china. Out in the pale air the cobbles shone, washed clean by last night's rain, and yet she knew, because she always did, that cleanness is not where innocence lives. It lives, if anywhere, in the small decision not to harm, taken over and over in the quiet places where no one watches. Chapter 10. Aftermath. In the days that followed the meeting in the church hall, St. Mildred seemed to exhale as though a long-held breath had finally been released. The news of Mrs. Harris's confession spread with the peculiar speed reserved for village matters. Yet even so, there was a marked difference in the tone of the conversations. The gossip was quieter now, tinged less with speculation and more with a reluctant sort of sympathy. It was difficult, after all, to reconcile the image of the cheerful, dependable Mrs. Harris with the woman who had twice poured tea with murder in mind. Miss Marple noticed how some avoided speaking of her altogether, while others mentioned her name with a kind of rueful bewilderment. At the grocer's, Mrs. Alder shook her head over a sack of flour and murmured, "You never do know, do you?" At the post office, Mr. Lenton, recovered enough to stand behind the counter, confessed to Miss Marple that he'd been half afraid to touch another cup since the day in the lane. Life was moving on, but the memory of what had happened lingered like the faint scent of smoke after a fire. The police had taken Mrs. Harris quietly, with no display beyond the necessary. Inspector Mallory, though still carrying himself with a certain stiff-backed authority, had stopped Miss Marple outside the vicarage 2 mornings later. "You saw what I missed," he said simply. "I'd have sworn Hargreaves was the one. I suppose I don't look at people the way you do." She had smiled in her mild, unassuming way. "Oh, but you do, Inspector. Just from a different angle. Sometimes it's the angle that makes all the difference." In the meantime, Mr. Hargreaves moved with an air of cautious relief. Though cleared of suspicion, he did not seem inclined to press the point in public. He returned to his duties at the church without fanfare, perhaps knowing that in a place like St. Mildred's, vindication was a quieter victory than most imagined. Lucy Trevelyan, for her part, appeared lighter in spirit, though Miss Marple suspected it was as much from the relief of having told the truth as from the end of the affair itself. One afternoon, Miss Marple accepted an invitation to tea at the vicarage. The vicar's wife had baked a seed cake, its familiar scent filling the parlor, and as they poured tea into unblemished cups, the conversation drifted inevitably to the question of why. She was frightened, Miss Marple said gently, not of what might happen to her, but of what people would think of her family. Pride can be a dangerous thing, you know. It can lead otherwise sensible people to make the gravest mistakes. The vicar's wife sighed. And to think, all over a secret most would have forgiven in time. Later, walking home through the soft twilight, Miss Marple paused by the green where the fete had been held. The grass had recovered from the trampling, and the only sign of that day was a scrap of faded bunting caught in the hedge. She stood for a moment, listening to the faint rustle of leaves, thinking of Mrs. Copley, of Mr. Lenton, of the cracked-handled cup now removed from the set entirely. Crimes, she reflected, rarely sprang from grand designs. More often, they grew quietly in the corners of human life, nourished by small grievances, whispered threats, or the fear of shame. Back at her cottage, she set her knitting aside and poured herself a cup of tea. The china was plain, the handle uncracked, and she held it with a steady hand. Beyond the window, the last of the day's light faded, and the village settled into its familiar rhythms once more. There would be other gatherings, other fetes, and other small intrigues. But for now, St. Mildred's was at peace, at least on the surface, and Miss Marple, as always, would be watching. The week after Mrs. Harris's arrest, St. Mildred's resumed its gentle outward appearance, though the truth of the matter lingered in the minds of those who had lived it. Life in the village, Miss Marple knew, was like a well-kept garden, neatly ordered on the surface, but full of roots that twisted unseen beneath the soil. The villagers preferred to see the tidy hedgerows and the flowering borders, not the tangled network below. Yet it was often in those hidden places that the real stories lived. One afternoon, Miss Marple received a letter from Inspector Mallory, written in a hand more careful than she would have expected. He expressed his thanks for her observations and quiet assistance, and admitted, with a trace of humility, that her cracked-handled cup theory had been the key to understanding the case. She read it in her sitting room, the soft tick of the mantel clock in the background, and allowed herself a small, private smile. It was not the credit that mattered, only that the truth had been reached before anyone else was harmed. Mrs. Harris's motives, laid out in full during the police investigation, had proved as she suspected, an old family scandal involving her brother in Bristol, which Mrs. Copley had learned of and threatened to expose. Fear had driven her to plan the poisoning with care, and when Mr. Lenton's suspicions began to grow, she acted again, less decisively this time, perhaps unsure if she truly meant to finish what she had started. Miss Marple thought of the hesitation she had glimpsed in Mrs. Harris's eyes that afternoon in the church hall, and of how pride had carried her further than malice ever could have. The harvest festival came and went without incident. The church was filled with baskets of apples, sheaves of wheat, and jars of preserves. Miss Marple attended, knitting tucked discreetly in her bag, and observed with quiet satisfaction that the tea was served in sturdy mugs, each one checked twice before it reached the table. People greeted each other warmly, if still a little cautiously, and Mr. Hargreaves, restored to his place in the community, poured cups with a steady, unshaken hand. Lucy Trevelyan, carrying a tray, caught Miss Marple's eye and smiled. A smile of relief, but also of understanding. That evening, in the peace of her cottage, Miss Marple set her knitting on the arm of her chair and poured herself a cup of tea. She stirred it slowly, watching the faint spirals in the cup before taking a sip. Cases such as this never quite left one. They became part of the quiet tapestry of village life. Woven in alongside the fetes, the harvests, and the small kindnesses. People would forget the details in time, she knew, but the lesson would linger. The danger can hide in the most familiar hands, and that the smallest crack in a teacup or in a person may be where the truth seeps through. Outside, the lamplight pooled gently on the cobblestones, and the air held the first crisp edge of autumn. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell marked the hour. Miss Marple sat back, content in the knowledge that for now, St. Mildred's was at rest. But she also knew, with the certainty of long experience, that human nature never truly changed, and that another mystery would one day come along, quiet at first, waiting for someone to notice. And when it did, she would be ready.